They thought the earth was flat.
Then came the Enlightenment period.
Our names are
Gabby,
Jah'Vonni,
and Zay.
and we're here to talk about the Age of Reason.
also known as the Enlightenment era.
The Age of Reason era was known for its skepticism on political, scientific, and philosophical views in Europe during the 18th century. This period brought out individualism and exploration within many people.
Who were the important people?
John Locke.
John Locke was an incredibly bright man. He was a big influencer to the Enlightenment era with his ideas of government, education, and at the time, intensive science-based concepts. Locke believed that knowledge was not the discovery of anything either innate or outside the individual, but simply the accumulation of facts derived from sensory experience. And to discover truths beyond the realm of basic experience, Locke suggested an approach molded on the rigorous methods of experimental science, and this approach greatly impacted the scientific revolution.
Thomas Paine.
Thomas Paine was a failure of a man, in the normal sense, of course. He failed out of school by the age of 12, and he couldn't hold a job for his life. Nonetheless, he was never discouraged, somehow. Thomas Paine met Benjamin Franklin in 1774, when Franklin helped Paine immigrate to the United States, specifically Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, he went from a failure to sort of a big deal. In the United States, Paine joined the Continental Army, but sucked at being a soldier. Shocker. Instead, he created a pamphlet called The American Crisis. Essentially, it was his way of supporting the Americans getting their freedom from England. Paine's support for the revolution did not last long, since he decided to move back to Europe to work on his own inventions. A decade later, while being imprisoned for not endorsing the execution of Louis XVI, Thomas Paine wrote one of his most famous works, The Age of Reason. Thomas Paine's book, The Age of Reason, was an attack on the Orthodox Christian community. Paine was a deist, which means that he was a believer in God, but not that he was supernatural. Just that he created the earth and everything from there was solely possible through scientific explanations. The Age of Reason was basically Paine's way of exposing the Orthodox Church and other corrupt churches in general. Paine believed that the Orthodox Christian community was corrupt, politicized, and put their faith in nothing but myths.
Sir Isaac Newton.
Newton was surrounded by many influential scientists at his time at Trinity College, Cambridge. Unsurprisingly, he would become one too. Newton was greatly influenced by René Descartes and other philosophers who viewed physical reality as composed entirely of particles of matter in motion. Newton wasn't the best student ever. He didn't graduate with any honors whatsoever. However, he had a pretty good excuse for that. He was reading the works of at-the-time modern philosophers. And as a curious student he is, he wrote down notes and compiled them into a book referred to as, but also known as Certain Philosophical Questions in English. And as it turns out, with all of his time reading, he essentially discovered the concept of nature that provided the framework for the scientific revolution.
Political thinkers such as John Locke wanted a change from absolute monarchy. They started to evaluate how the politics and society could be way better. This resulted in the Glorious Revolution, which was from 1688 to 1689. The Glorious Revolution overthrew King James II and installed William and Mary on the throne, which thus began the Age of Reason, the time where individualism and personal freedom thrived.
John Locke's book, Two Treatises of Government, essentially states that all men are created equal against the claim that God made all people naturally subject to a monarch. However, in order to keep those birthrights, there must be some form of government to keep the community stable and to ensure life, liberty, and property. But if the government is not keeping the community stable and not providing the means for life, liberty, and property, the people have the power to establish another government. An example of this literary piece in motion is the ruling of James II.
Two Treatises of Government was a response to the debate of whether there could be a law forbidding James II from becoming King of England. Failing, James II reigned for 3 years before being forced out of the throne by the Glorious Revolution.
Now we have Thomas Hobbes, who wrote Leviathan, which was a huge impact, just like two treaties of a government. Thomas Hobbes believed the right of a human being was self-preservation and the life of man was and is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. However, we as human beings should not fear groups or the individual, but instead we must have a protector, and that under this social contract, individuals give up all rights, while those of the protector are absolute. Basically, a monarchy with no divine rights, and the public can decide whether the ruler is fit for the country or not. One of Thomas Hobbes' most important works was Leviathan. Leviathan can be recognized as a major contributor to Western political philosophy, mainly in its ideas of a social contract between ruler and ruled. Then we have the scientific revolution, which was already happening for a while, but the rapid expansion really began during the Age of Reason, and the person that stood up front was Sir Isaac Newton. Newton's most influential book was called Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, which was published in 1687 and holds the 3 laws of motion. This book explained the physical world to many people during this time. Not all the events during the Age of Reason were good. For example, the Gordon Riots of 1780 were in response to legislation passed permitting Catholics greater freedom in society. Not everybody wanted that. The riots were so bad that around 20,000 troops were deployed and around 300 rioters were shot dead by soldiers. So even though we did have a lot of individualism and freedom coming out, not everybody supported it. Historical events change the mindset of people affected by it, which then leads to innovative ideas and influences on the world. Sometimes people don't realize everything came from something. Coffee houses, newspapers, and literary salons, which are like when people meet up in a group and they talked about general literature instead of a specific book, emerged from the Age of Reason. You just gotta think, would we have Starbucks today without it?
The English language was not very common during the Age of Reason. Instead, Latin was used because it was the international academic language of Europe. It was very commonly used in the Roman Catholic Church, therefore it was also used in a child's education, which meant that it was taught in most academies. French had its own purpose as well. A majority of diplomats wrote and spoke French, and French was considered the official language of the courts of Europe. French and Latin were some of the most used languages during this time because of their ties with the monarchy and the church. It was these two establishments that were under attack during the Age of Reason. Joy, a feeling of great happiness. Oh hey, this is just my children's dictionary. This thing is nothing compared to what Ephraim Chambers created. It's called the Cyclopedia. When Ephraim Chambers made the Cyclopedia, his goal was to create a place where anyone can study the upcoming language, English.
All of a sudden you speaking English now, huh?
A little.
The Cyclopedia has multiple branches, specifically 47, and he listed the articles that belong to each. This way, while people are reading about a certain topic, they can also learn the meanings of each word as they read along. Chambers made a huge breakthrough in the English language with his cyclopedia. It was the first cyclopedia that included the arts and sciences, and to mention that it was all written in English, it was truly one of a kind.
The American Revolution was a giant war between colonial Englishmen and Great Britain. The colonial Englishmen felt as though the acts imposed on them by Great Britain affected their natural rights, in which John Locke spoke of, such as the right of life, liberty, and property. Democracy was an idea that came out of the Age of Reason. In the U.S., we now have a democracy in which the people have more of an effect in the government, such as voting on laws. The French Revolution was inspired by the Age of Reason. The Age of Reason made the citizens realize that they had rights that not only the leaders and elites had.
As you can see, the Age of Reason informed many concepts and ideas that we use today, such as the type of stores, the English language, and democracy. And the Age of Reason also started many historical events, such as the American Revolution and French Revolution. All in all, we can say this is a pretty big, important era.
I hope your life is a bit brighter with knowledge.